Well, good morning, friends. Welcome to the Biblical Perspective for March the 6th, 2021. Thanks for joining me this morning. We'll be looking at the face of persecution all around the world. For those of you who are in the West, and if you think you're free from it, think again. We're going to show you how it may be coming to a state, maybe even a county, maybe a school system near you. Won't be able to touch on all of these, but we'll just get started with it today. So let's look at not only the face of persecution, but what Jesus said would be taking place in the last days before he returned. We find it in Matthew chapter 24, and we'll begin in verse number 9 this morning. It's smack dab in the middle of the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus lays out some things that will be taking place in those final days. He says, Then you, speaking of believers, followers of his, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. You will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness in the 1984 NIV, iniquity in the King James, but in most versions, Christian Standard Bible, Amplified, Darby, NASB, uh, ESV, Young's Literal Translation, you see the word lawlessness. That's right. Remember that one. Because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of most will grow cold. And so we live in times that seem to mirror exactly what Jesus was saying in this part of his Olivet Discourse. Then we pick up the newspaper this week and see just how people are being lured into a totalitarian type system all around the world that we only dreamed of as fiction back in our high school days when we read books like 1984 or Brave New World. On the cover of the Epoch Times this week, we see the picture of Jeff Bezos and the headline, Amazon bans books for undefined hate speech. All of a sudden, titles are disappearing from all kinds of places. Yes, Nazis piled books up and burned them, but in the electronic world, all you have to do is click delete and say, we will no longer provide that book, sell that book, or allow it to be distributed. It seems like those who are in control in those electronic worlds have way more power than we ever wish we had ceded to them. Well, in particular, this shows a little of how we can try to get things out of society that we're uncomfortable with, while at the same time looking at the bottom of that same front page of the Epoch Times, and we read this headline: Chinese regime burns religious books and jails believers. The first paragraph reads, The Chinese Communist Party has kept up its broad attack on faith amid the COVID-19 pandemic, burning and trashing religious books while jailing spiritual adherents for possessing religious literature. As we look at this phenomenon that seems to have cropped up from nowhere, it really hasn't. It's been laying around for a long time. We notice that uh, or all around the world we have it. It's just in different forms. In America today, it seems like we are experiencing it more and more that if you say the wrong thing, you'll be canceled, you'll be censored, you'll be dropped, you'll be deplatformed, you'll be removed. You can't speak up anymore in the land that once cherished free speech. In Amazon's case in particular, it talks about one particular book that was reported in February was banned from all of it was being sold on Amazon, and all of a sudden disappears. The book was When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. It was a 2018 book by Ryan Anderson, president of the Washington-based think tank Ethics and Public Policy Center. Well, Amazon purged the book around February 21st this year. Well, the exact timing's hard to pinpoint since the book's author only learned about the move from people who were looking for it, as he told the folks at the Daily Caller. Well, that's just one of many that's been erased and is being erased left and right in many of our platforms. In particular, it says that transgender ideology has become one of those focal points of this far left progressive political system. It fuses discussion of the severe quality of life issues faced by transgender individuals with the quasi Marxist intersectional criterial theories that divide society into oppressors and the oppressed based on characteristics such as race or gender identity. It's the same thing that has eliminated some of the Dr. Seuss books this week. eBay has announced they're dropping about half a dozen Dr. Seuss books, as many other platforms are, and that they won't be allowed to be read in public schools or taken out of those libraries, destroyed, they disappear, they're gone. Why? Because apparently there is some kind of what someone has claimed are racial or bad overtones in some of those books. Now, the question is if they can eliminate some of Dr. Seuss's books, won't they come back and eliminate the rest of them? Because if you're going to demonize his writings, it always follows that these people come back and demonize the author. So forget the cat in the hat and all the rest of them. Eventually, you've got to, if you're going to follow the same pattern you've been doing with all these other authors, you remove every work of theirs, you remove everything about them. Matter of fact, you want them to be erased from history. So, friends, get ready. There'll be more of those moving out of the way. In fact, as you've watched Disney and others begin to take away old movies, old cartoons, and other things that they may have said were just too insensitive, we can't let people see that and know what it was like back in those days, you're going to see more and more of that. Now, why should Christians be worried? Because ultimately, we are being shadowed with all those voices that are saying, look, the evils of society come from the basis of the Christian faith. These are the people who have the problems. Read that ugly book of theirs, the Bible. It's full of all kind of junk that we can't have our children reading. And there is a tremendous call. It's an undertone that eventually is going to become an overtone about pulling down all Christian theology and Christian, at least basic conservative Christian values from all of society because it clashes with what's going on in this far leftist agenda. It's already happening all around our country. It's very similar to something that did take place in some of those works of fiction I talked about earlier. I'd like to reference an article that I'd love for you to read if you get Imprimis, which is a publication of Hillsdale College. There was a great article by Larry P. Arnn, the president of Hillsdale. He talked about a course that he has taught there on totalitarian novels. The students in the class read four of them: George Orwell's 1984, one called Darkness at Noon, Huxley's Brave New World, and C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength. And he analyzes why these novels were important and what they were telling us about maybe even the day we're living in today. He talks about 1984 in particular. Most of us remember having to read that in high school, and I remember thinking, what a stupid book. We would never have a society like that, would we? And yet we're seeing some of these things actually come to pass. The protagonist of 1984, he writes, is a man named Winston Smith. He works for the state, and his job is to rewrite history. He sits at a table with a telescreen in front of him that watches everything that he does, and to one side is something called a memory hole. When Winston puts things in it, he assumes they are burned and lost forever. Tasks are delivered to him in cylinders through a pneumatic tube. The task might involve something big like a change in what country the state is at war with, or when the enemy changes, of course, then all references to the previous war with a different enemy need to be expunged. Or the task might be something small. If an individual falls out of favor with the state, photographs of him being honored need to be altered or erased altogether from the records. Winston's job is to fix every book, periodical, newspaper, etc., that reveals or refers to what used to be the truth in order that it might conform to the new truth. This was played out even in a movie that was made about 1984. And one of the pictures it shows there is quite interesting. Winston's awareness of this endless, mighty effort to alter reality, Arnn writes, makes him cynical and disaffected. He comes to see that he knows nothing of the past or real history. Quote, every record has been destroyed or falsified, he says at one point. Every book has been rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street and building has been renamed, every date has been altered, and that process is continuing day by day, minute by minute. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. Does any of this sound familiar? Arndt asks. Yes, it's something that's going on all around us today with lightning speed. It's changing what we're supposed to be thinking of history and what we will allow our children to think of history. It changes the very basis of our society to the point that we no longer recognize some of the things that we used to consider and know were truth. Well, having been there, done that, many of us know the names of many of those who are being trampled upon today. We've got to rename our public schools because certainly none could be named after folks like Washington or Jefferson or even Lincoln. So what names do we pick for those schools? And you'd be shocked to see what kind of characters are now being placed on centers of education for your children. Well, in particular, Arn picks one of these particular characters that's being demonized left and right, and that is Thomas Jefferson. He says America's school children today learn two things about Thomas Jefferson: that he wrote the Declaration of Independence and he was a slaveholder. This is a stunted and dishonest teaching about Jefferson. What do our school children not learn? You see, what's subtracted is almost as important as what's placed in there. And it was a generation ago that I said that the subtraction of God from our public education system will ultimately result in a group of leaders that have now grown up as adults, having God subtracted from their psyche, that are going to try to lead us down some demonic black holes. Folks, we are there. We've arrived. Why? It's not because of what we taught so much as what we didn't teach. Back to Arn's article. He says, what do our school children not learn about Jefferson? He says, well, they don't learn what Jefferson wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia when he said, and I quote, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, end quote. He also wrote in that book regarding the contest between the master and the slave. He said, quote, the Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest. Now, if school children learned those things about Jefferson, they would learn that he was a complicated man like most of us. It wasn't just as simple as folks would like to make it out, so that you can just throw Jefferson down that black hole and erase him from history. They also don't learn that when our nation first expanded, it was into the Northwest Territory and that slavery was forbidden in that territory. They don't learn that the land in that territory was ceded to the federal government from Virginia, of all places, or that it was on the motion of Thomas Jefferson that the condition of the gift was that slavery in that land would be eternally forbidden. That's interesting, isn't it? Yes, it was Jefferson who said no slavery in those territories, and that's the only way you get this land from Virginia. Now, if school children learned that, they would come to see Jefferson as a human being who inherited things and did things himself that were terrible, but who regretted those things and fought against them. And then they would learn, by the way, that on a scale of human achievement, Jefferson ranks very high. There's just no question about that, for no other reason than that he was a prime agent in founding the very first republic dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The astonishing thing, after all, is not that some of our founding fathers were slaveholders. There was a lot of slavery back then, as there had been for all of recorded time. The astounding thing, the miracle even, one might say, is that these slaveholders founded a republic based on principles that were designed to ultimately destroy slavery. Interesting that that particular angle is never supported or even brought out when we're trying to demonize these founders of our country. But they're being demonized for a reason. Those who want to take over our country have an entirely different group of principles in mind. Back to China for a moment, because there, what's happening is exactly what many of these people want to happen right here in the West. In October of 2019, this is one of many examples, a state library in one northwest province in China was criticized for conducting a public burning of dozens of what they called illegal publications or media with religious content. There in that particular place, it was compared to the Cultural Revolution back in Mao's day, when books were burned and religious artifacts smashed, as the Chinese Communist Party attempted to stamp out all traditional Chinese culture and other religions and tighten its ideological control over the population. It's hardly an isolated incident. It's what's going on all over China even today. As we notice, the population of China that was Christian rising exponentially in a revival unprecedented in all of history, the Chinese Communist Party felt quite threatened and began what has now become one of the greatest persecutions in history. In an article, it also reads this quote: "The Chinese Communist leader Xi Jinping and his regime have engineered the worst religious persecution since the end of Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution in the 1960s," writes Bob Fu, a Chinese American pastor and founder of the US-based Christian nonprofit, China Aid. It goes on to tell stories about what's happening there. If you even have something as seemingly innocent as a bookstore, you could be in trouble. One particular Christian bookstore found was discovered by the local communist officials to actually be selling religious materials. That's a no-no for them. The owner of the bookstore was sentenced to 7 years in prison in October this past year and fined 200,000 yuan. His customers from other provinces, 3 different provinces, reported raids of their homes by police who seized their religious books. One was charged with selling unapproved religious books imported from other countries. So that's terrible. That might have something that would try to pull the rug out from under our Chinese Communist Party. Last September, a Shanghai court sentenced some 16 people for operating an illegal business that printed more than 200,000 religious-themed books without a license, even including some Buddhist works. It doesn't matter. If it's something that seems to go against this ridiculous regime in China, which now has got to promote, matter of fact, they've made a declaration: you cannot be a member of the Chinese Communist Party and be a member of a Christian church. It's now illegal. So if you want to be a part of our regime, you got to drop all these fantasies, these superstitions you've got about religion. We can't have you doing that and working in our government. That's now forbidden. I could go on and on about the atrocities going on in China, but let's jump to another continent, for example. In that very same newspaper, there was this headline: Nigeria's hybrid threat, terrorists allied with bandits. With kidnapping a prominent weapon, Muslim Fulani tribesmen now wage war against Nigeria's Christians. For years, in what can only be described as a mass genocide, this war has been raging in Nigeria to try to turn it into an Islamic state. Christians are routinely either kidnapped for ransom or kidnapped, their children are kidnapped to try to brainwash them out of the beliefs of their parents, or their villages, their churches are burned and people massacred. Over and over and over again, these kind of things happen in Nigeria. And here in the West, we do not even hear about it because our news media doesn't think it's newsworthy. We don't even get a line or two at the bottom of the scrolling screen while we're watching some of these wonderful megastar news reporters rant and rave about whatever they're upset with at the time. Friends, we are watching all around us exactly what Jesus said would take place coming to bear. And if you're one of those who believes in Christian moral values, you believe in monogamy, and you believe in a man and a woman having a sexual relationship in a bond that is called marriage, and that nothing else fits that definition, then you are now the enemy. You're the enemy if you hold any of those values and want to propagate them to your children. And if you stand up against the government and the tech giants that are promoting the other side of that, you become the one that is going to be blackballed, blacklisted, and eventually they'll be able to pull your existence from society, make you almost disappear if they can't make you change your mind altogether. Folks, we're back to China for just a minute. Here we are in the United States where we were told that China is okay. It's just fine. I'll be doing an episode here not too long down the road about how China has been slowly, consistently buying up the United States of America, trying to make sure its influence is felt right here in every aspect of society. We watched as the NBA sold its soul to China, and somebody saying, "Oh, but don't you know the players could put social justice messages on their jerseys? Really, you could?" Yeah, unless you wanted to say stop persecuting Christians in China or free Hong Kong or either. No, those were not allowed. Why? Because of the big bucks that China has used and has made many of even some of the NBA coaches turn into mouthpieces of support for China and leftist organizations, even defunding our own police because it would make the Chinese Communist Party happy. Friends, it's sickening to my stomach to watch what's happening to our own society as we fall for this junk and fall into it left and right. What's going to happen? Just what Jesus said was going to happen. Even in your own families, you'll have folks who get on both sides of this political fence, and that's what it's going to be called. It's going to be called a political divide, as if it's something about Democrats and Republicans or left and right. Oh no, friends, it's about right and wrong. And that's where the rub comes with many of us. People no longer understand what is right and what is wrong. That's why, in the words of Jesus, you will be handed over to be persecuted. Some of you put to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of me. Oh, it's you Christians who want to throw a wrench in the engine because you want to say, wait a minute, that's wrong. You can't promote that as a government. Well, if that's the way you feel, then we'll show you who's really in charge. We won't let you speak anymore. Ultimately, if you don't get in line, we'll shut down even your places of worship. We will take you, as this is what happened in China, we'll even take you off the air. You can't even broadcast anymore. We'll cut you out of the internet. We'll show you who's got the real control and the power in this world. Don't be surprised as you see more of this happen. Jesus told us it would be true. He told us it would come, and to the point that he said, many will even betray each other. In another place in the scripture, he said sometimes it'll be even parents and children being divided. Sometimes it'll be brothers and sisters divided over these issues. Friends, whatever takes place in our world today, make sure that when you're divided from those who have a different opinion, the side you are standing on is the side with the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the only place to be safe in these days. It's the only place to know that even if they attack you, come after you, even threaten your life, it's the only place that you can be secured forever. I don't know about you, but I'm standing with the Lord in these days, even in the face of Christian persecution. Well, God bless you. Go to church somewhere tomorrow. Worship with God's people. Draw strength from the joy, the peace, the love, the fellowship that you can have with God's people. If you can't do it in person, do it virtually. And let's stick together as a body of Christ as we face the challenge of these days. God bless you. I'll see you then tomorrow with a message from First Baptist Church, and then Monday as we wake up in the Word.